My name is Nicholas Tampio. I'm really grateful to be here. So what I'm going to do today is talk about academic freedom and the evolution of academic freedom and how we can defend academic freedom. I think that's just an incredibly important thing to do in our era, and I've spent my sort of professional life thinking about it, and I want to think with you about how to defend it. So let me explain a little bit about why I care about this topic. I'm a political science professor. One of my research interests is education policy. And one thing I do is in my academic work, I research academic policy and how it's made. And one of the things that I'm really consumed by is the question of uh, who influences what happens in the classroom, right? How much is it the classroom teacher? How much the administrator? How much legislators? How much private companies? And so I publish peer-reviewed academic work on this topic, but then I also try to write op-eds for the public, or I don't try, I write op-eds for the public and try to get my ideas out there. So here's an article I wrote a couple years ago for The Conversation. And what it was doing was it was explaining the Trump administration's plan to merge the Labor Department and the Education Department. And as somebody who spends a lot of time studying K to 12 education policy, I think I had an interesting take, an informative take on people. And I wrote this op-ed, and nobody criticized me, right? Nobody called for me to get fired. I mean, I had arguments with people about it, but nobody called for me to get fired. And so when you study the history of academic freedom, I'm the person that they had in mind. I mean, when you read John Dewey and others, I mean, it's really social scientists who they were concerned about. And they were concerned about social scientists who would say controversial things in public. So I have a very deep vested interest in protecting academic freedom. I write, I don't know, 6, 10 op-eds a year. It's my way to participate in public. It's my way to do politics. It's very important to me. I want to make sure that I can protect it, and I want to make sure my friends can do so too. So this is the good story. This is academic freedom working, but there are examples of academic freedom not working. So my friend Maura Finkelstein was a professor at Muhlenberg College. She's Jewish. She's anti-Zionist, and she is very outspoken, and she is fearless, if you ask me personally. And in early 2024, she retweeted or reposted an Instagram post that was very controversial. And we could talk, giving 3 lectures. So the third lecture, I'll come back to this case and we could talk more about it. But she tweeted something very inflammatory, very provoking. And the whole Muhlenberg Hillel community and the alumni base and certain administrators and students on campus, they all sort of mobilized to get her fired, and they succeeded. And it's a real shame. I mean, the AAUP produced a document about her case, and it's something like 30 pages, single space. So it's a complicated case. And I realized that the Instagram post that she shared went right up to the edge of academic freedom, right? If she had asked me, I would have said, you might sit on that, you might sleep on that before you reshare it, but she didn't. She shared it, and basically it inflamed a lot of people, and it provided grounds for Muhlenberg College to fire her. So academic freedom is fragile, right? Just because we have tenure doesn't mean that it will always protect controversial speakers. When I want to think about the next 3 days with you, and really this is a work in progress, so I'd really like to hear from you. If you have thoughts, I'm happy to get emails, tampio@fordham.edu, hear your thoughts on some of these things. But I'm really consumed by the question of how do we defend academic freedom? It's under attack. State legislators, particularly red states, but not just in red states, it's under attack. I'm really thinking about how do we make a persuasive case for academic freedom. And my strategy and just a lot of my research is that I revisit the history of ideas. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. There were some great German philosophers at the end of the 18th, early 19th century who were thinking about this. There were some great American pragmatists and American philosophers in the early 20th century thinking about that. I don't think we can take their ideas directly from the past and apply them to the present for all sorts of different reasons. One, it'll just sound weird, and two, our thinking about all sorts of things has changed. But I think we can take some useful ideas from the past. So that's my ambition in the next few days. The plan for today's lecture, I'd like to say a little word about alt liberal arts and myself, so you know what you're sitting in for. I want to describe the cephalus problem. I think that Plato and the Republic really identified the core of the issue, and it's the Plato's Republic, but it's right now, right? Plato saw the dynamic of what's happening, so I want to describe that. Then I want to describe how the German philosophers responded to the cephalus problem. I think that they had a pretty good idea. When you look at the history of academic freedom, it really started in about 1810, right? That the medieval European university was a totally different thing than the modern research university. And it's really Wilhelm von Humboldt who creates the University of Berlin and articulates the idea of academic freedom. And then the end of my lecture will really just acknowledge that academic freedom is precarious, that as long as there are rich, powerful people who are necessary to fund higher education, their academics are going to have to figure out how to convince these people to support higher education, even when academics criticize them. That's the dilemma. That's why I don't think we're ever going to solve the problem of academic freedom, in the foreseeable future, as long as they're universities. So I'd like to say a word about alt liberal arts. Alt liberal arts is a global education initiative concerned with academic freedom and civic engagement in the liberal arts. In collaboration with Bard College and the Open Society University Network, Alt Liberal Arts Colleges offers free global online lectures and courses for which you could register at altliberalarts.org. And I would like to thank the New College community for inviting me and for hosting these lectures. And I'd like to thank Mary Ruiz, Mila Wimbush, Kimbu York, Stephen Miles, and Pat Ucker, who are going to be the discussants. The last two are going to be the discussants, and Mary Ruiz will be the discussant today. So it's really an all-star lineup of New College people. So it's an honor for me. I'm really touched by this opportunity. If you look at this picture in the center, right, there are three dorm rooms or three windows. My freshman year, I lived in that center dorm. And so, New College is dear to my heart. And what I'm going to be saying in the next few lectures is really sort of me giving thanks to my education and paying it forward, right? Even though the old New College is gone, I mean, among many of us, the spirit still lives and we can keep it going, right? So even though I'm at Fordham, I'm still, a New College student, New College professor. So I'd like to say a word about myself. When we pick up books, we often read the biographies of the authors on the back of the book. So I want to be modest. I think it's good to be modest, but if I'm going to be talking, you should know a little bit about who I am. So here are just a few things to know about me. I went to New College of Florida, right? I grew up in Washington, D.C. area, went down to New College, which was a sort of amazing experience. I was a Gene Lewis student, Doug Bergeron student. Went to Indiana for 2 years, learned the ropes of political science, and then I was at Johns Hopkins for 8 years. There I am working in the library. And actually, I can see that I've got some Kant in front of me. It was extremely intense, rewarding, brutal, hard. Glad I did it. Then I was a visiting assistant professor at University of Virginia and Hamilton College and a few other schools. And at the bottom, you can see a picture of me with Fordham President Joseph McShane, and I'm currently teaching at Fordham, but I'm also an associate editor of the Journal of Politics. Why am I saying this? One is because I've spent my whole life either attending or working in higher education. And even though I'm going to be drawing upon philosophers, really the philosophical concept are like bricks, and my experience is the mortar. I mean, I saw it, I lived it. I mean, I feel like I've part of my life has been spent in Bildung and Wissenschaft, and I'll explain what those concepts mean. But I think I'm well positioned to give a talk about the ethical vision underlying research universities, liberal arts colleges, and academic freedom. Okay, now I'd like to shift to philosophy, and I'm going to go back to, one of the key texts in early Western political philosophy, and it's Plato's Republic. And if you've read gone to college, you've probably read Plato's Republic. And I mean, this, what I'm about to describe is the opening pages, right? It's one of the most famous books in the history of ideas, opening pages. So many of you have read this, but I'll just give you a recap. All right, so it's the Cephalus problem. So the opening of Plato's Republic, Socrates is going to the Piraeus. He's been to the Piraeus. He's seen the religious festival. He's walking home, and then Polemarchus sends a slave to grab Socrates' cloak and bring him to his home. And when Socrates comes to Polemarchus's home, here's what the dialogue says. Cephalus, Polemarchus's father, was also at home, and he seemed very old to me, for I had not seen him for some time. He was seated on a sort of cushioned stool and was crowned with a wreath, for he had just performed a sacrifice in the courtyard. We sat down beside him, for some stools were arranged in a circle there. Soon as Cephalus saw me, he greeted me warmly. Okay, just imagine the scene that, right, Socrates, his coat is grabbed, or cloak is grabbed. He's brought up to this house. He sees this old guy. They seem to be on friendly terms. They seem to want to talk about the olden days. And I mean, one way to read Plato's Republic is that each of the characters stand in for a certain type of human being, right? So each person is symbolic of a certain person. And so Cephalus is symbolic of a wealthy, conservative elder, right? He's religious, he's wealthy, and we're going to see in a minute, he's not a philosopher. And then they start to have a friendly conversation, and Socrates asks Cephalus, "How do you like being old?" And Cephalus said, "Well, it's not so bad. I'm free of sex. I don't have to worry about that mad master anymore. And as long as you have a good character and you're at peace with things, then life's pretty good." And then you have this scene. Socrates says that I was full of wonder at what he said, and wanting him to say more, I stirred him up, saying, "Cephalus, when you say these things, I suppose that the many do not accept them from you, but believe rather that it is not due to character that you bear old age so easily, but due to possessing great substance. They say for the rich there are many consolations." All right, so this is sort of like, I just want you to imagine what this dialogue is like, right? That's like two older guys, they're just chit-chatting with each other. Cephalus just, he's got sex on his mind, religion is on his mind, and all of a sudden Socrates provokes him, right? And all of a sudden you realize that Socrates is symbolic of the philosopher and Cephalus is symbolic of this sort of old conservative elder. And the situation can get pretty tense pretty quick. All right, then they go back and forth, right? And then Socrates is full of wonder and he starts to think, what do you mean by what do you mean by justice? I'm gonna skip a couple passages, but then Socrates says that this isn't the definition of justice, speaking the truth and giving back what one takes. It most certainly is, Socrates, interrupted Polemarchus, at least if Simonides should be believed at all. Well then, said Cephalus, I hand down the argument to you, for it's already time for me to look after the sacrifices. Am I not the heir of what belongs to you? Said Polemarchus. Certainly, he said, and laughed, and with that he went away to the sacrifices. So what I want to suggest is that this is one of the key moments in Western philosophy, right? Because Cephalus could have just said, did you just insult me to my face in front of all these people? Like, Socrates, you leave. Or, the slave who grabbed Socrates's cloak, Cephalus could have said, "Slave, beat up Socrates, or get him out of here. Like what's he doing? Like we're just having a relaxed conversation, and all of a sudden Socrates is raising the temperature in the room. Like Socrates is out of line." So for me, I think that this passage is incredibly important in the history of philosophy, right? Because if Cephalus doesn't leave, the dialogue doesn't happen, right? And when I teach this to my undergrads, I bring up pictures, and there's never a shortage of people who could be Cephalus, right? It could be Putin, it could be Xi Jinping, it could be Erdogan in Turkey, it could be Modi in India, it could be Trump, it could be Biden, right? I mean, there's no shortage of Cephalus characters because I think that Plato understood a fundamental dynamic that you need people like Cephalus to provide the space, right? The whole dialogue of the Republic happens in a space that made possible because of Cephalus's wealth. Presumably, if they ate or drank anything, it would be because Cephalus or Polemarchus provided it, right? So you need people like Cephalus to fund the operation, right? They're the trustees, right? You need them to fund the operation, but you also need them to leave, right? So the Cephalus problem is, how do you get rich people to support academia but not interfere? Right. And so, I mean, when I was thinking, I mean, I had no shortage of examples of possible examples of Cephalus, but I mean, here's just Trump, a crazy, crazy tweet about Harvard University. Perhaps Harvard should lose its tax exempt status and be taxed as a political entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist inspired supporting sickness. Remember, tax exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the public interest. This is what happens when Cephalus doesn't leave, right? This is when Cephalus doesn't want to pay, doesn't want to leave, right? Just to make sure I'm not being partisan, I mean, I don't know if you remember this, the students probably won't remember it, but I mean, at one point Obama was talking about higher education and he basically made fun of art history majors and said, we shouldn't be sending young people to college to study art history. We should be teaching them to be electricians or something like that. And an art history professor wrote to him, and then Obama wrote a charming response. But Obama said it. Like I mean, I wrote a couple op-eds about Obama's higher education policy. He had some really terrible ideas for higher education. If anybody wants to ask me questions, I have not forgiven Obama for some really terrible ideas. Here's my thesis. German philosophers invented academic freedom as a solution to the Cephalus problem, so that all of the German thinkers who I mentioned, who I have in mind, Kant, Schleiermacher, Fichte, Schelling, all of these people read Plato. They thought of his dynamic, and my thesis is that all of them were trying to think about how to protect Socrates from Cephalus while still enabling Socrates or academics to live a good life. And I chose this afternoon a picture of Noam Chomsky, right? That he's an example of academic freedom working to protect Socrates, right? That Noam Chomsky is a very outspoken critic of American imperialism, an outspoken defender of civil liberties. He had a very successful career at MIT. And so the fact is that, academic freedom worked, right? The Germans figured out a way to protect the outspoken philosophers like Noam Chomsky. Just want to remind you, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'm going to be happy to have a dialogue with people who are here. All right, so let's talk about the Germans who invented academic freedom. There's one hero, there's one main hero of this story, and that is Wilhelm von Humboldt. Wilhelm von Humboldt lived from 1767 to 1835. Um, Wilhelm von Humboldt is a household name in Germany, but in America, his brother Alexander von Humboldt is more famous. He was the great naturalist, probably the greatest scientist of the 18th century. Andrea Wolf, a German author, has written several wonderful books about Jena and the von Humboldts, but a wonderful book about Alexander von Humboldt. Wilhelm von Humboldt was friends with Schiller, Goethe, Schleiermacher, Fichte. I mean, really just this incredible combination of philosophical geniuses at this one small University of Jena. In the 1790s, he wrote a book called The Limits of State Action, which is one of the foundational texts of liberalism. And then by this sort of unbelievable bounce of the dice, that in 1808 to 1810, only 16 months, he was put in charge of modernizing the Prussian education system. And one of the things he did is he founded the University of Berlin. So University of Göttingen, University of Jena, University of Halle, there were already great universities in Germany, but the first original modern research university was the University of Berlin. And he wrote a document explaining the philosophy behind it, and academics keep going back to it to understand, like, there could have been a lot of alternatives to research universities. Like, why do we have those rather than alternatives? So here's something that von Humboldt said in his document. Higher academic institutions are the pinnacle of a nation's moral culture. This notion follows from the calling of such institutions to pursue knowledge in the broadest and deepest sense of the word and devote themselves to the use of knowledge, not as material arranged according to particular external purposes, but rather as the autonomous, self-arranging material of intellectual and ethical formation. Bildung, right? There's a lot squeezed in there. Let me just pull out a few of the ideas. All right, so I've been saying that universities, there could have been other things. Well, one thing there could have been was polytechnics. So Napoleon, what he did is that after the French Revolution, after he came to power, he wanted France to be a military and economic power. So he created polytechnics that really emphasized engineering and the applied sciences. What's different about universities is that they're dedicated to Wissenschaft, which is just, fancy word for saying pure systematic knowledge. The right? It's that we need people to study Sanskrit. We need to have people who study the French philosophy. We need people to study the Italian Renaissance. We need, right, everything that you see at a research university. That's kind of Humboldt's idea, right? That's what a university is. You have synergy among all these different academic fields. Universities educate the entire nation. They sit atop the entire education system. I'm a political philosopher. Von Humboldt and John Dewey and other great thinkers about academic freedom are also political philosophers, right? They realize that if you have universities with outspoken figures in them, it's going to change the political culture, right? The fact is that, American politics for the last few decades, has been influenced by Noam Chomsky, right? I saw him speak at Johns Hopkins and he filled up a huge auditorium, right? And it's partly because of his politics, but also because of his perch at MIT, right? So this is illustrating Humboldt's idea that universities educate the entire culture. Universities spread a conception of the good life, Bildung. And so there's a wonderful book called Forming Humanity by Jennifer Hurt, who actually used to be a philosophy religion professor at New College of Florida. I never took a class with her, unfortunately, but she wrote a wonderful book about Bildung. And it really is a conception of sort of like build as an image and build in is like building, like you're kind of making yourself into something, right? And so you've got an image of like what it means to be a cultured person. So a cultured person is really good at one thing, but they also have an interest in a lot of different other things, right? So you major in your college, but you also take a smattering of courses in Shakespeare and economics and biology, and you participate in the cross country team, and act in the school play, like all of that, right? So you're trying to develop yourself as a work of art. For the Romantics, Bildung involves excelling in one thing and appreciating other things, many-sidedness, according to Goethe. I mean, this is a fantastic concept, many-sidedness. What we call higher academic institutions are nothing other than the intellectual life of humanity. They are the intellectual life to which our inner strivings for knowledge lead when we have the external leisure that allows us to pursue those strivings. The state must always remain aware that it cannot and will not acquire on its own the scientific and scholarly knowledge it wants. In fact, that is never anything but an impediment as soon as it meddles directly in the production of knowledge. So, human beings find fulfillment in pursuing knowledge, right? So that opening line is just a restatement of Socrates' line that an unexamined life is not worth living, right? That human beings, we have a telos, the telos or end is to think. And so, right, there's a direct line between the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and the German idealists. Universities provide scholars leisure. That's a key concept for Aristotle, schole. That's where we get the word scholar, right? That the fact, I have a friend, a dear friend, who says, academics need to start preparing for life after the collapse of the university. And maybe he's right, but it scares me, right? Because I mean, I spend 10, 12 hours a day working. It's a pleasure. I love it, right? Leisure is not the same as fun. Leisure just means that time spent where you don't have to be, selling things or making things. And those are all important jobs. Society obviously could not survive without people doing those important jobs. But, if you're going to have scholars, you need to make sure they have schole, leisure. So here's the deal that Humboldt is proposing to the king. The universities will supply society with lawyers, doctors, and bureaucrats, right? The purpose of academic freedom is to allow academics to be outstanding, right? It tells academics you may be free to pursue the truth wherever it goes. And in that process of adding to knowledge, you're going to have to master all of the knowledge that came before you. And then you're going to be on the cutting edge of knowledge. And people who do that are going to be good teachers, right? You don't want people who are teaching 100-year-old textbooks, 20-year-old textbooks, right? You want people doing cutting edge work. So Humboldt is telling the king, Cephalus, right? The Cephalus figure, listen, I realize you might not want to do this. I mean, Napoleon just beat you in the early 19th century. You're trying to figure out how to rebuild Germany. The temptation is just to figure out how to build bigger cannons and, bigger supply chains and all those things. But Humboldt is saying, listen, if you want those things, then you need to give academics freedom, and they will provide those valuable things. However, the price you have to pay is you're going to have to put up with some annoyances, right? Academic freedom is going to create some gadflies, right? That's Socrates, right? That's what he was. He was this gadfly to the city, right? He stung the conscience of the city. And the fact is that, I mean, university towns are places of, unconventional lifestyles and bohemian lifestyles and newspapers and concert halls and art galleries. And, the fact is if you have a university without that, that's not good, right? You want your university town to be, a little bit of a counterculture. And so von Humboldt didn't use those words, but maybe I'm just filling in my own thinking about it. But that's at least what I think that Humboldt is doing is he's making this transaction with the king. Right. So that von Humboldt to the German elites, we will educate your children, prepare them for careers and leadership roles in society. So, I mean, that's one of the best selling points of higher education. For me, that's why people like DeSantis don't want to necessarily destroy higher education. DeWine in Ohio, or I mean, curious about Trump. I'd be curious to hear what you think. I think they're going to stop before they destroy higher education because they realize they want their own kids to go to Harvard, or they want their own kids to go to University of Florida or New College of Florida or Ohio State University. So it's a chicken, it's a game of chicken, right? That these politicians, don't like being insulted by academics. They don't like when academics correct them. They don't like when the academics go to the state legislature and correct how the politicians in Florida or wherever are doing their business, right? But I think that people like Cephalus want to make sure that Polemarchus gets a good education, right? They want to make sure that their own children get trained to be leaderships. I mean, one of the things when you do a good college is you get used to being around lots of different types of people. That's good. You want that, right? You want to be around people who challenge you, and you want to be able to stay nice and calm when you're presented with alternative perspectives. So, what Humboldt is telling the German elites, listen, we'll educate your children, but you just need to, part of the deal is they might become a thorn in your side, right? They might get piercings, tattoos, name changes, jobs you don't like. They might pick a backpack and go, across Europe or to India, right? That's just the price you're going to have to pay for all of the benefits that come with higher education. All right, I'm gonna skip this one. I can come back to it. But basically, what the deal that Humboldt told the king was like, if you want all the good things that come from higher education, you got to give us academic freedom. All right, so let's think about what happened after 1810, right? After Humboldt wrote this famous document. Humboldt wanted the University of Berlin to achieve financial independence, right? He saw the Cephalus problem, right? He knew that if the University of Berlin didn't have financial independence, then the king or the king's appointed minister would be able to, try to interfere with education. So that he saw the problem as well as I did, right? I assume a bunch of us are new college people, right? I mean, I went to New College from 1991 to 1995. it was a glorious era in New College. Like it was, I don't know, I'm biased, but I think it was one of like a golden age, right? But anybody who's familiar with the history of New College knew that it couldn't survive financially without state support, right? So there was a sort of Damocles hanging over New College when I arrived, right? And I mean, the whole, I'm dating myself, but do we stay part of USF? Do we become part of FSU? Do we try to become independent? Hooray, we're independent. But a lot of us were a little bit like, ugh, this is, it was good that USF had us under its umbrella in a way. I don't know if preserving that would have changed anything different, but the fact is that we were not able to solve the financial problem in time. Not our fault. I don't think it's our fault. I think, a liberal arts college in a red state like Florida is going to be tough sailing. So anyhow, King William the third said no, right? That he's not going to do that, and the idea got dropped. And basically, the idea of the research university, it persisted in Germany, right? So 19th century Germany had the best higher education system in the world. I've got this book, Empire of Ideas, talking about sort of the German research university. The idea migrated to America. So in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about sort of the ideas of how it migrated and changed once it came to America. But something like 10,000 Americans went to Germany in the 19th century to study at the universities. And so when you study, Johns Hopkins, where I went, or University of Chicago, or Cornell, or Harvard, or eventually, all the Jesuit universities, and then the idea migrated to liberal arts colleges. I don't know if Mike Michelson is on the call here, but like, one of the things that Mike did was that he was sort of insisting that academics at New College publish, right? That's the research university migrating down to liberal arts colleges, right? That I'm at the so I'm when I started my academic career, I knew certain older academics who still believed in this old-fashioned model that colleges are just to impart knowledge and universities are to produce knowledge. At this point, if you're at any sort of decent college, you're expected to publish or perish. There's a whole story. I could give a whole lecture. I'd have to do some research, but Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois in the research university, right? He went to Germany, University of Berlin. If you read The Souls of Black Folk, you realize that he's in conversation with lots of different German philosophers, including Hegel and Herder, the great thinker of nationalism, right? So, I mean, the influence of the research university has just been profound. The book I was talking about, William Kirby's book, Empire of Ideas, the ideas migrated to other parts of the world, right? It's moving to India and it's moving to China. I'm going to China later this summer to give some lectures. And I mean, I really think that part of what I'm going to be doing is sort of like, China's doing just fine. They don't need me to do anything. But I mean, the fact is that like, we're having this exchange and we're creating this international sort of sphere of intellectual life, which is what universities do at their best. And then Americans would embed academic freedom in higher education in the early 20th century. So the story is picked up, right? That von Humboldt was not able to solve the problem. He couldn't stop the Göttingen Seven from getting fired. But in the early 20th century, the Americans figured out this institution of tenure would be a way to protect academic freedom. And it's a really brilliant idea. So if you want to join the conversation, next week, I'll be talking about the invention of tenure in the 1915 AAUP statement or Declaration on Academic Freedom and Tenure. So a recap before the questions here. Academic freedom is the right of scholars to pursue systematic knowledge, Wissenschaft, and ethical and intellectual self-formation, Bildung, right? So here's part of anticipating the third lecture. I think we need to figure out a modern language to sell these to people, right? Because people aren't going to pay for a research university unless you give them a reason, right? Research universities are expensive. You have to have some sort of explanation for why the research library subscribes to lots of different journals. and why there's a museum on campus and why there are three tennis courts. Right, obviously, if you're going to train tennis players, you're going to have a dozen courts. You're going to have the Bollettieri Academy, but Fordham has three or four different tennis courts. Like, why do we do that, right? And so I think we have to figure out a rationale for why universities have the model that we do. Why do we have a theology department, economics department, sociology department, English department? Why do we have all these departments squished together, right? I mean, if you're just doing economies of scale, it really shouldn't you just have one school that's economics, one school that's political science, one school that's art history? I mean, I think we have to, in some way, revive these German ideas of why we have this funny institution like the research university. The idea of academic freedom has a history. It started in German idealism and romanticism, right? It's von Humboldt. Von Humboldt himself was a little square compared to some of his friends, right? Some of his friends were a little bit more emotional than he was, but I mean, he definitely was picking up the ideas that were in the air. So, what are the arguments for academic freedom? Systematic knowledge leads to a blessed life. This is Schelling's idea. I love that. But I realize it's not going to be a great selling point for a general audience, right? It's a great idea to go to, it's got a great idea to go to graduate school. I mean, I was in graduate school 10 years. That is a long time to be in graduate school. I mean, I think maybe my parents are watching this lecture. Like, we all, were worried whether this was going to pay off. But I mean, when I was actually in grad school, like I loved it, right? Just because you're just thinking ideas and like you're living on this trans-historical plane, right? I'm like talking to Humboldt, I'm talking to Du Bois, I'm talking to Shakespeare. I'm like, grad school is awesome. But that's not a great argument for the general population. So what you're going to tell the general population is, hey, listen, if you send your kids to a research university, that's going to be the best possible preparation for them to be lawyers, doctors, bureaucrats, in the old days, ministers, right? I mean, that's the selling point of college. I would love it to be, oh, it's just great fun, or it's a great chance to grow. And I mean, I believe in those arguments, but I mean, at the end of the day, you got to make sure that you're preparing people for careers. The modern variant of this is that universities train entrepreneurs. I don't think that's an incorrect argument. I mean, I think that you're allowed to play on that ambiguity. I think Humboldt and other defenders of academic freedom are willing to do that, right? I mean, an entrepreneur is somebody who creates something new. Entrepreneurs can take up all sorts of different possibilities, right? So Warby Parker, I mean, maybe many of you have Warby Parker. I mean, it was started by somebody who went to Johns Hopkins when I was there. So, and it's fun to look at my former students, right? Jared Solomon at Hamilton College, right? He's doing five-star golf, and it's like he's doing it, right? So, like I taught him, he was a really great student, wonderful senior thesis on John Stuart Mill, and now he's a golf. He has these golf shops or golf trainings locations in New York City. He's doing great, right? So that's good. Like we should be advertising that, and I'd like to say that in my own way, I contributed to some of my students' success. But academic freedom is always going to be controversial. Why? Because it empowers teachers and students to question the rich and powerful. So, from my perspective, the Cephalus problem is always going to remain with us, right? That Socrates is always going to be stinging the wrong person, picking a fight with the wrong person. We need to articulate the ideals that say, hey, listen, don't fire Chomsky, don't fire Tampio, don't fire Maura Finkelstein, right? That if you want all the good things that happen from higher education, you have to allow these eccentric heretics, iconoclasts, etc. Now, I'd like to have a conversation with Mary Ruiz. Mary is a senior executive in healthcare and CEO of Ruiz Strategic Advisors. She served as chair of the New College of Florida Board of Trustees. I watched her video, where there was the transition, and I don't know, it was great TV, very stressful. I think Mary did a fantastic job. Grace Keenan did a great job. Ron Cristaldi, one of my friends, and who's on the board of trustees, I think he did a really nice job doing the best he could in the circumstances. Mary is the chair of Alt Liberal Arts, and so she's the one who invited me, so I'm really grateful that she did. And I'd like to hear what she thinks, and I'd like to hear what other people think. I see that there are a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'd love to hear that. But maybe I'll just start with Mary. What do you think? Do you think that the cephalus problem is a good way to describe sort of the dynamic of what we see in higher education?
I think cephalus is a good place to start because what I believe is going on now in higher education is really about power. Um, these these coordinated initiatives have been long planned, silently planned. The tactics are coordinated. They share a great deal in common in terms of lack of transparency and disregard for due process. And so it's really about cephalus being activated. It's really about him coming in the room and wanting to influence what is and how things are taught. Maybe no one really let him know that was within his power. It never occurred to him. And so I think what we're dealing with is a kind of uh, bizarre circumstance where it's not just that we need cephalus and he may or may not help us, but he's working against us.
Well, here's what I would say. When I was a grad student at Johns Hopkins, I realized in New College in Indiana, like my whole career, I mean, I've really, if you have any historical awareness, you'll realize that academic freedom is an incredibly rare thing, right? It's as rare as the Renaissance, right? It's Lorenzo Medici saying, you know what, Donatello, I'd like to see some of your sculptures, right? He could have just said, I'd like more cannons, right? Or you think about Julius II, the warrior pope. He said, all right, Michelangelo, go for it with the Sistine Chapel. He didn't have to do that, right? And the same thing with American higher education. One of the things in my biography I put up was University of Virginia. When Thomas Jefferson presented University of Virginia's all-American idea, but really, he had a correspondence with George Tickner, who went to Germany, saw Göttingen. And so, the fact is that University of Virginia is kind of based on the German model, right? So like I taught at UVA, I learned this. UVA is circled by churches. Thomas Jefferson didn't allow there to be a church built on campus. Now, as it turns out, once he was dead and he couldn't fight back, they did put a church on campus. So there is a church on the center of campus. But the fact is that, you're right, Mary, that, I don't want to make it personal, right? I think you and I are probably thinking of the same person as, the cephalus here, right? And I don't know, like, the fact of the matter is that like, sometimes you can convince cephalus, you know what, cephalus, you want to be cool? Why don't you invite Judith Butler to campus? You want to be cool? Why don't you invite Stanley Fish? Why don't you invite him to campus? Or why don't you show you're really cool by like restarting gender studies program at New College, right? Like sometimes it works, right? So, I think,
Well, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but Judith Butler was invited to New College.
yeah, no, I watched the video. It was great.
Yes.
It was great. I watched the Stanley Fish thing and I watched a few others. No, I think so the fact is that like our side is always going to get our butts kicked, right? The fact is that academic freedom is not going to is not going to protect people always. If powerful people want to get rid of somebody, they're going to get rid of somebody, right? But I guess just what I would say is in 2025 on June 4th, the fight's still going. Like we haven't been entirely defeated. Like we got to keep going, right? We haven't quite seen where things could go.
I agree, and I think that one of the things that the current times call for is self-reflection,
Yeah,
because it's academic is being tested for a reason. Um, and there have been critiques of academia that we've not really done a great job in responding to, that we're elitist. Michael Sandel wrote a great book, Tyranny of Merit,
right,
about the implications of that kind of elitism. It's expensive. What is the value for life and work?
right,
Um, and is tenure really serving anyone but the faculty? Is it a kind of entitlement?
right.
And what is worthy of study? So these are reasonable questions. And
And,
I don't know that we have done a, a thorough job of really responding to them in ways that those who raise the issues might consider.
yeah, no, and when I went to New College, I was a little bit considered a square. I would think I was a little bit square compared to some of the other people, right?
Me too, Nick. Don't take it personally.
Oh no, it's good. It's good to be like it's good to be square at New College, right? But I had plenty of friends who are not square. But the fact is that I think we need to think really like we in higher education need to keep selling. Need to have annual, yearly advertising campaigns. We need to have focus groups. Not that we just need to present, we actually need to contribute, right? So I'm at Fordham in New York City. We're constantly thinking about what we can do with the Bronx in good faith. How can we tutor kids at the school across the street? How can we do garbage pickup? How can we do volunteering in various stations in the Bronx? We try to be good citizens. I'm sure there, if any Fordham faculty are watching, there are plenty of people who don't think we do enough. So, um, and just I'm talking today defending academic freedom, but I published an article about a year ago, just not original to me, but like we in academia need to think about how to make allies with certain conservatives, right? That, I mean, I see certain of the questions here, like are the attacks made in good faith? Sometimes not. Hey, Dan, Shambliss, right? Like sometimes they're not made in good faith, but sometimes they are, right? And I don't think you can make any a priori rules about, how to proceed because like if you're going to be Socrates, you're going to say outrageous things, right? I mean, if you've read Plato's Republic, I mean, if at one point Socrates says, I think philosophers should be king. The city won't have peace until philosophers become king. And then Glaucon, who's the young man in the dialogue, he's like, I'm going to rip my shirt off and start fighting you, right? You can fight better when you're not wearing a shirt, like in hockey, right? Like can't grab anything. So like Glaucon's like all ready to start fight, right? So Socrates is going to be provoking the audience. Um, so you want to preserve that, right? And I want to preserve my friend's Maura Finkelstein's right to repost on Instagram pretty inflammatory stuff that's going to offend a bunch of the students, right? There's a direct line, Socrates, Maura Finkelstein, like that. She's in the lineage. Plato's the more famous of Socrates student, but there's also Diogenes, the cynic, right? And I wish that Diogenes got a little bit more play. So like Socrates can lead to like pretty aggressive antisocial behavior or challenging social behavior. So you don't want to get rid of that, but you also don't want to provoke fights unnecessarily, right? You also
And I think that maybe I'll have a little Diogenes in me, but I'm a little more cynical about the motivations because I think it is in not to generalize, but in many instances, it's really about power.
yeah, no,
It's really about power. It's about influencing what and how it's taught. It's about creating a sorting hat. Are you Gryffindor or Ravenclaw? And if you're Gryffindor, God help you. It's Ravenclaw here on in. And so I think that there's an interest in control. Activism is disfavored. Certain subjects are disfavored. And I think that there's a disregard for principles that would be fair-handed, due process, free speech, contract law, tenure. There's a disregard for things that would promote the interest of both sides, and so I'm a little cynical that maybe the intentions are not good. And I think for me the real telling moment, and the reason that I stayed on as chair for the 8 months that I did, is because I shared Dr. Oker's aspiration that New College could be a place where conservative and progressive thought is actually in dialogue. We would be
yeah,
the model for the nation. But what happened after that is that um, those it wasn't about elevating conservative dialogue and engaging it with progressive dialogue. It was about destroying the other side and eliminating departments and eliminating professors who did not meet the mold. And so I share Dan's question of is it really well intentioned? That's not to say that everything that's done is
yeah.
well intentioned, but um, I have a concern that we're really dealing with identity politics, and so the other
Mhm.
side can't be given an even concern for individual liberty or due process. That's not what they're about, and that's the most alarming thing to me about the challenges to academic freedom, because it's really about power and identity politics.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I see there was a question about from Carolyn Barker about the Greeks. Why am I going to the Greeks? And the fact of the matter is that Wendy Brown wrote a great article, Judith Butler's partner, called "Left Conservatism," and Wendy Brown loves the great books. And like the fact is that I'm not doing this because I say you have to agree with Plato. I'm just trying to. It's a very nice way, I think, to describe the perennial problem between academics and trustees, or academics and
I,
rich.
I don't think it's a bad strategy because the other side's going to the Greeks.
Yeah. I think it's weird. Let me say two things. I think it's a little bit weird that they're going to Homer, the Odyssey. They're making everybody read Odyssey at New College now. I'm like, Plato, philosophy starts with Plato. Why are we reading, Nietzsche wrote a great essay about Homer's contest and talking about Plato versus Homer. Like this is the great thing. And um, I thought that Pat Oker did a fantastic thing by lifting weights with students. That was what we needed. I wish he had more of an opportunity. I think she did the best she could in the hand she was dealt. It might have been too late. I'm sorry, but like she was doing the right thing, right? Because what you're sending the signal is like, listen, come to New College and you'll get in shape and you'll get strong. That's a good selling point, right? I mean, universities should have good gyms and should, for those who want to do it, they should be ample opportunities to physically exercise. We're not compromising our principles by saying you should have a
No,
gym.
I think it's great to have athletics at New College. I don't know that we need bass fishing and
Yeah.
and maybe 10 or 12 athletics, but I do think athletics is a good thing. I I I think that we also might be overlooking something important if we don't talk about that what is at stake is not only an academic problem, um, because people are basically challenging the basic idea of competency. People who have no experience in education can teach, can run universities. Um, our ability to reason together in public is being compromised. You've offered examples of it. We're not supporting the cultivation of individuality because of censure and self-censure and fear of having negative consequences. And so I think our preparation for civic engagement and our commitment to the common good is the other important thing that's at risk, right along with academic freedom.
Yeah, well, a few things is that, if you study what's happening at universities around the world, it's often competence is not valued, right? So my heart aches for Turkish academics. I had a Amnesty International letter writing campaign at Fordham with my colleague Annika Hinza, and we wrote letters to Turkey, and it does what it does. But yeah, Turkey, that Erdogan is putting his hand-appointed people in key positions. Modi is doing the same things, right? He's battling JNU. He shut down Ashoka, well, not I think Ashoka University is still around, but he fired one of my friends, actually, some political theorist who I just spent time with at Princeton. So yeah, we should be angry about it, and we should realize it's a global thing that, people don't value expertise. They don't like to be insulted by smart people, right? They want to put their buddies in key positions here. I'd like to respond to Pat Oker's question in the comment, and what she wrote is, I'm curious about whether Humboldt saw the benefits of universities beyond educating future generations. I'm thinking specifically of the benefits of so much of our research in improving the lives of citizens, even those who never attend college themselves. Was research seen as a public good in both short and long term? There's a lot there. I'll just say one or two things. Is that Humboldt was a great political philosopher, and The Limits of State Action is one of my all-time favorite books. John Stuart Mill took it, a quote from it, and made it the motto of On Liberty. Yeah, no, the thinking is that if you have universities, you're going to be training elites to be readers, to be museum goers, to be newspaper readers, to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to go to opera, right? So it's going to create this cultured environment that's going to change all sorts of things, right? In the olden days, the history of universities, Fichte used to made a big deal about this. They would settle things with swords, and they would have duels, right? Like Marx, if you ever see a picture of Marx, like he has a slash in his eyebrow from a duel, I think at the University of Bonn. So yeah, that's what college used to be. We've improved. You know what I mean? Like that's one of the things the research university was trying to do, is to try to phase out solving disputes through violence. So yeah, but I'll make one more response to Pat. Was research seen as a public good in both short and long term? I'm thinking about Harvard's response to the Trump administration. So Alan Garber is the president of Harvard. He made this public statement, and it led off by saying Harvard is doing all this research in biomedicine, and if the world wants the benefits of Harvard's medical research, you got to stop threatening us by canceling all of our grants. So, I think that Humboldt would have appreciated that argument. I think every academic who thinks that, budgets matter has to pay attention to that. You have to have a winning argument, you know. But the challenge that Humboldt was trying to say is that you have to be able to defend the public good, but also question the reigning conceptions of the public good, right? So yes, it's easy to sell Warby Parker and the internet invented at colleges and things like that. But I mean, I think the challenge that Humboldt was really wrestling with is you have to show that you can't have the good without the things that the elites don't like. I don't know if that answered your question, but I mean, it's the question of how you can sell higher education to a skeptical audience and be true to what higher education about. I mean, that's been the live issue for two centuries plus.
I had an experience at the Florida Board of Governors where they had invited CEOs from utility companies, tech companies, finance companies, and the Board of Governors was asking these CEOs, what do you need from us in terms of your workforce?
Mhm.
And the financiers started out by saying, well, we need certification in these sort of financial softwares, and the IT guys needed certain competencies in the basics of their field, and but then they just sort of broke down and they said, you know what we really need? We need people who want to learn. We need people who can think. We need people who aren't intimidated by big problems with no obvious solutions. We need
Yeah.
people who can work with other people on these complex problems. And of course, I wanted to jump up and say they should all go to New College. But the CEOs already know what they want. They agree with us. They
Yeah.
they want, and I think where we kind of get off the rails sometimes in our arguments is, we start talking about subjects, gender studies, race studies. Um, it's really not about the subject. It's about the
Yeah.
process, because you and I could have majored in history or political science. We could have picked 3 or 4 fields that we had been equally happy in. But it was the process of learning how to learn, learning how to think, learning how to defend your position, learning how to write, learning how to analyze problems, not being intimidated by something that looked too big. And so it's the process, not the subject. And I think by allowing the argument to get hung up on the subject,
Yeah.
that we might be doing ourselves a disservice, because then they can pick and choose what they think is worthy. It's all worthy
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
learning
Yeah. In my
in
lecture,
higher education.
yeah, no, I mean, there's a German notion of Lehrfreiheit. So it's Lehrfreiheit with an N in it, Learnfreiheit. And, the new college motto of in the last analysis, we're each responsible for our own education. I mean, that's Lehrnfreiheit. That's it's up to you, and are you going to make the most of it? And I think you're right. Majors are a part of it, but walls are a part of it, and art galleries are part of it, and sailing's a part of it, and going abroad is a part of it. And I mean, Carolyn asked about 2 years, and there's well, when I was a few years after I left Hopkins, the president was really pushing Hopkins giving BAs in 3 years. I think that's fine. I think everybody has their own journey. It's just, the beauty of 4 years is that there's a lot of time to explore. And when you look at all around the world, many advanced societies don't give young people that opportunity. I think that's like actually a really wonderful thing that the United States done. And so I think that's a valuable tradition. So, you know, honestly, a lot of the benefits could happen in 3 years, but I like the 4 years.
Well, one thing I should mention is that alt liberal arts doesn't represent New College or the authorities at New College now. That we are an independent organization, and so this discussion is independent.
Yeah. Well, this was wonderful. So I'm going to wrap it up. I'll keep it a neat hour. In on June 11th, I'll be discussing the 1915 AAUP Declaration on Academic Freedom and Tenure, and we'll be discussing the American context. And I'll just like to say thank you to everybody who watched. And if you want to send me an email, tampio@fordham.edu, I'd be happy to hear it. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.